We are in the midst of the worst chronic disease epidemic humans have ever faced in our history. Today, 1 billion people around the world suffer from diabetes and obesity combined, a condition that Mark Hyman defined as diabesity. Obesity in adolescents has quadrupled just in the past 30 years, and now almost 20% of kids ages 6 to 11 are obese. 600,000 people in the United States die of a heart attack each and every year. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men now suffer from an autoimmune disease. Over half of adults in the US take prescription drugs, 40% of the elderly take more than 5 medications, and 90% take over-the-counter drugs. According to the Centers for Disease Control, autism prevalence has more than doubled since the year 2000, and that's not just because of an increased rate of detection. The number of people diagnosed with depression has increased by 20% each year. Unfortunately, there's every sign that things are not going to get better, but they're actually getting worse. Today is the first generation of kids in modern history that's expected to live shorter lifespans than their parents. If current trends continue, in 2 decades, 95% of Americans would be overweight and 1 in 3 will have diabetes. Now, the consequences of this disease epidemic are profound. It's been estimated that the cost of diabetes alone is $250 billion a year. Now, to put that number in perspective, the World Health Organization has estimated that the cost of ending world hunger would be just $200 billion, which is less than we spend each year treating a completely preventable disease. If healthcare spending continues at its current pace, the US would be insolvent or bankrupt by the year 2035. Our annual healthcare expenditure hit $3.8 trillion in the year 2013, and almost 25% of our gross domestic product that same year. Now, with this expenditure, we should have incredible healthcare. We should be reversing and preventing disease and doing minimal harm. Unfortunately, statistics show just the opposite. According to a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the year 2000, medical care itself was the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And since only 5 to 20% of iatrogenic events are reported, the authors of the paper speculated that medical care could, in fact, be the #1 cause of death. Each year, medical errors are responsible for 200,000 extra deaths, $77 billion in extra healthcare costs, 8 million extra hospitalizations, and 77 million extra drug prescriptions. So why is our healthcare so ineffective? Well, the simplest answer is that it's not actually healthcare. A better description of what we have would be disease management. Modern medicine is amazing in many ways. It's incredible for emergency medicine and trauma care. If I get hit by a bus, I definitely want to be taken to a hospital. Our human lifespan is longer than ever because of it. We're starting to be able to reattach limbs, we can restore sight to the blind, and in our lifetimes, we may even be able to fight cancer with nanorobots. But I think that we can all agree that conventional medicine is not very good at promoting health or preventing or treating chronic disease, which is really the biggest problem that we're facing today. Our system is focused on suppressing symptoms with drugs. If you have high blood pressure, you'll be given a drug to lower it. If you have high cholesterol, you'll be given a drug to lower that. There's rarely any investigation into what caused the high blood pressure or high cholesterol in the first place. Now, there's definitely a time and a place for medications, and some are much better than others, but there are 4 fundamental problems with basing our health system almost entirely on drugs. Number 1 is that drugs rarely address the real problem. To use an analogy, let's imagine that you had a rock in your shoe and it was making your foot hurt. Well, you could certainly take ibuprofen or some other painkiller to reduce the pain in your foot, but wouldn't a better solution be just to take off your shoe and dump out that rock? Number 2 is that drugs don't just suppress symptoms, they also suppress functions. An example of this is that many people take NSAIDs like ibuprofen to cope with arthritis or inflammatory conditions, and these medications can be effective in relieving pain, but the problem is that they also reduce blood flow to cartilage. Blood carries all the nutrients and immune substances that we need for tissue repair. Ironically, taking NSAIDs can actually worsen the problem if they're taken chronically, because they actually reduce one's tissue's ability to heal. Number 3 is that drugs often correct one imbalance by causing another or several others. The diagram on this slide shows the interactions among proteins in a fruit fly. As you can see, If a drug interferes with one protein, it will inevitably affect many others. This causes what we typically refer to as side effects, but if you think about it, there are really only intended effects of a drug and unintended effects. And of course, the problem is that unintended effects of a drug often far outnumber the intended effects. The fourth reason that basing our healthcare system on drugs is a bad idea is that biological systems are redundant. The same molecule will have many different functions in the body. Histamine is a perfect example. It plays an important role in inflammation in local tissues. So for example, if you have a mosquito bite or a bee sting or a rash like you see on this slide, that's often mediated by histamine. But in the brain, histamine actually increases the function of neurons. So if you take an antihistamine to suppress an allergic rash, then you're also affecting histamine receptors in the brain and downregulating the function of neurons, which then cause drowsiness. This is, of course, why antihistamines are often taken by people or prescribed by physicians off-label for insomnia. So we need a new approach to medicine, one that emphasizes healthcare over disease management. What would such a new medicine look like? It would have three specific characteristics. First, it would recognize the exposome as the primary driver of health. Second, it would embrace an evolutionary or ancestral perspective. And then third, it would apply a functional medicine approach to care. So let's look at each of these in more detail. Number 1. The exposome is the primary driver of health. The exposome is a concept that was originally proposed by Dr. Christopher Wilde in 2005, and it refers to the sum of all non-genetic exposures in an individual lifetime, starting from the moment of our conception through the moment of our death. It encompasses the food that we eat, the air we breathe, social interactions, lifestyle choices, and inherent metabolic and cellular activities. Research divided the exposome into three categories. One is specific external, and this refers to things like your diet, the water that we drink, physical activity, and the personal and home care products that we use every day. Number 2 is the general external. These are the broader external influences like the overall environment that we live in, things like air pollution, social interaction, and climate. Then you have the third category, which is specific internal. This is our metabolism, hormones, our microbiome and metabolome, inflammation, and oxidative stress. These influences are key. In fact, we now understand that the exposome is the primary driver of disease. According to recent estimates by the World Health Organization, over 50% of mortality is related to just three factors of the exposome: air pollution, cigarette smoking, and diet. At one point, it seemed like genetics would hold the key to human health and disease. The 20th century was really a heady period in terms of genetics. It was characterized by the discovery of DNA, the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR method of amplifying and studying DNA, and then of course ultimately mapping the entire human genome. Now this led to an era of biological determinism, which was the idea that human health and even behavior was almost entirely controlled by genes, and it led to some pretty bold proclamations like this: "We now have the possibility of achieving all we ever hoped for from medicine." That was from Lord Sainsbury, the UK science minister. Also, mapping the human genome has been compared with putting a man on the moon, but I believe it is more than that. This is the outstanding achievement not only for our lifetime, but in terms of human history. And that was from Michael Dexter from the Wellcome Trust. Unfortunately, those promises really didn't pan out. The limitations of using genes to predict and prevent disease became apparent pretty early on. Ironically, Craig Venter, who was one of the first to sequence the human genome, was also one of the first to recognize its limitations when he said, "We simply don't have enough genes for this idea of biological determinism to work." We now know that genetics accounts for less than 10% of human disease and that the remaining causes are environmental, which is to say that they're really related to the exposome. The majority of mutations of single genes, which we now refer to as single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, are highly prevalent. This means that they occur frequently in the population. You might think that they play a significant role because of that, but these SNPs also, for the most part, have low penetrance, which means that they don't often manifest in clinical disease, and they will only do so in the presence of specific environmental exposures. This is to say that the mutation or polymorphism of a gene doesn't necessarily guarantee dysregulation of that gene. Put another way, genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. This relationship between genes and environment is what's studied in the field of epigenetics, which literally means on top of genetics. The simplest definition of epigenetics is changes in gene activity that don't involve alterations of the underlying genetic code, but still get passed on at least one successive generation, and possibly two, according to recent research. DNA was originally considered like a template or a mold, where you could pour raw genetic material into that mold and 100 different times and you would get 100 different identical copies. This is, of course, biological determinism, the idea that genes really run the show and environment has little to do with it. But we now know that that's not the case. A better analogy between genes and environment would be a film or theater production. Genes are like the script, and then the cast crew, costumes, director, and everything else that goes into making the production is like the environment. If you consider Romeo and Juliet as an example, the script really hasn't changed much since it was written by Shakespeare in the late 1500s, but it's been performed and produced in hundreds, if not thousands of different ways. If a script is terrible, even a great director or cast or crew won't be able to save it. On the other hand, even a great script won't matter with a terrible production. This is to say that genes are definitely important, but our environment and how genes express is more important in most cases. This explains why identical twins are similar but not the same. Identical twins are matched for genes, age, sex, pre-gestational environment, and often post-gestational environment, but while it's true that they have a higher risk of having the same diseases, that risk is not 100% the same. In fact, we see discordance rates of up to 50% in identical twins, even in highly heritable conditions. Schizophrenia is a good example of this. It's a disease that's known to have a strong genetic component, yet if one identical twin has it, the other twin only has a 50% chance of having it. So this, of course, suggests that the exposome and epigenetics play an important role even in diseases with a strong genetic component. The agouti gene in mice causes the production of a yellow coat instead of a black coat and also leads to a high risk of obesity and diabetes. But when methyl donors like B12 and folate are given to pregnant mice with the agouti gene, that gene is silenced in their offspring. This means that agouti genes doesn't express in their offspring, and their offspring will be lean with a dark coat. This is also, interestingly enough, true for pregnant mice's offspring's offspring, their grandchildren. Another example in mice showed that behavior and cognitive function is even subject to epigenetic influences. In one study, researchers exposed mice with genetic memory problems to an environment that was rich in toys, exercise, and extra attention that would be expected to improve cognitive function, and these mice showed a big improvement, in fact in memory formation and cognition. But what was remarkable is that their offspring also showed a similar improvement despite their genetic predisposition to having issues in this area and despite no extra attention or enrichment like their parents received. We don't just see this in animal studies, we also see it in human studies. One of the best known examples is the Dutch winter hunger cohort. This is a group of people that lived through a period of extreme famine in Holland during World War II from November 1944 to May of 1945. Because of the German blockade at that point, food rations of people living there were less than 1,000 calories a day. Babies that were in utero during this period experienced a wide range of adverse health effects later on in life, including higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. They were also more likely to be infertile. They had higher rates of personality disorder, depression, and psychosis. Another similar example is the Norrbotten cohort. This is a snow-swept, sparsely populated area of northern Sweden. And at least in the 20th century, it was so isolated that it was entirely dependent on the local harvest. A Swedish physician named Dr. Lars Bigren drew a random sample of 99 people born in 1905 and then used historical records to trace their parents and grandparents, and he analyzed agricultural records to determine food availability for that entire cohort. What he found was that boys who enjoyed rare, overabundant winters had higher risk of obesity, diabetes, and early death compared to other boys who didn't experience those overabundant winters. On average, they also had a lifespan that was 6 years shorter than the other boys, and this was true once again for their offspring as well. So all of these effects were passed on to at least one successive generation. All of these examples that we've just talked about illustrate the role of the exposome and epigenome in health and disease, and particularly the importance of early life exposures. So what does all this mean? There's bad news and good news. The bad news is that choices our parents and even our grandparents made affect our disease risk and our health, and that choices that we've made, perhaps before we knew as much as we now know, affect our children's and even our grandchildren's health. The good news is that genes are not our destiny. Genes certainly have an influence over our destiny, as we've discussed, but changes that we make in real time can affect our gene expression and, of course, not only our own health, but if we're still procreating, our children's health and their children's health. And it makes the focus on the exposome, primarily a healthy diet and lifestyle and environment, even more important. In the previous examples I gave, not everybody who was at higher risk of disease actually went on to acquire that disease or die early. And the environment, or the exposome, was almost certainly the main factor that determined which of those people that were at higher risk got sick and which stayed well. So while we can't control what our parents or grandparents did or our genes, we can control these diet, lifestyle, and environmental influences. The second principle of the future of medicine is that it embraces an evolutionarily or ancestral perspective and framework. The evolutionary biologist Theodosius Chabansky once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." What did he mean by this? All organisms are adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And when that environment changes faster than the organism can adapt, mismatch occurs. This is a fundamental principle of evolutionary biology, and it applies to humans as much as it applies to any other animal or organism in nature. For 66,000 generations, humans ate primarily meat and fish, wild fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. We were physically active. We didn't sit for long periods. We lived in sync with the natural rhythms of light and dark, in direct contact with nature, and in close-knit tribal and social groups. Both our ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers who have been studied were lean, fit, and remarkably free of chronic inflammatory disease. They were also superior to us in nearly every measure of health and fitness, from body mass index to blood pressure to insulin sensitivity to oxygen consumption to vision to bone density. You might be thinking, so what? Why should we care about the health of our paleo ancestors? They all died when they were 30 years old anyway. It's true that our paleo ancestors did have shorter lifespans on average, but those averages don't consider challenges that are largely absent from modern life, including high rates of infant mortality, warfare, trauma, accidents, exposure to the elements, and a complete lack of emergency medical care. Studies have shown that when these factors were considered, contemporary hunter-gatherers and our ancestors lived lifespans that were closely equivalent to our own today. But the difference is that they reached these ages without acquiring the inflammatory diseases that characterize our old age. They didn't have obesity, they didn't have heart disease, no diabetes, gout, hypertension, or most cancers. In other words, if our ancestors survived the threat of early childhood and escaped the threat of trauma, they lived long and healthy lives. So what happened? What transformed us from a healthy, vital people, largely free of chronic disease, to a sick, fat, and unhealthy people? It was a 1-2 punch, and agriculture was the first blow. Scientist Jared Diamond calls agriculture the worst mistake in human history. Hunter-gatherers were virtually guaranteed a healthy diet because of the diversity and nutrient density of the foods that they ate. But once humans settled down and started farming, there was a major shift in our diet. Our average carbohydrate intake shot up, and our protein intake plummeted. The quality of protein we ate also decreased. And as you can see in the tables on these slides, animal protein is more bioavailable than other plant protein. Soybeans are close to beef, but they contain something called phytic acid, which inhibits protein absorption. And if this had been considered, they would have even been lower on the list. Notice how low whole wheat and wheat protein or gluten are. Notice that legumes, on average, are much lower than even some plant proteins and any animal protein. Vitamin shortages also became common. Our new diet relied heavily on a limited set of crops such as wheat, rice, and corn, and it was lower in more nutrient-dense animal products. This led to diseases such as beriberi, pellagra, rickets, and scurvy that are caused by nutrient deficiency and were rare in hunter-gatherers but became much more common in people living in agricultural societies. We also saw an increase in tooth decay and anemia due to iron deficiency, increases in infant mortality, and decreases in average bone density. All of these diseases, again, were rarely experienced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We also shrank. The average height for hunter-gatherers at the end of the Ice Age was 5 feet 9 inches for men and 5 feet 5 inches for women. And after agriculture, that decreased to 5 feet 3 inches for men and 5 foot tall for women. The second blow was the Industrial Revolution. There is no doubt that agriculture led to an overall decline in human health, but the Industrial Revolution was really the knockout punch. It brought us to where we are today, when white sugar, flour, and vegetable oil make up over 50% of the calories that the average American consumes on a daily basis. We're more sedentary than we've ever been. We sit while we work and increasingly even sit while we play. We're chronically sleep deprived. A third of Americans sleep fewer than 6 hours per night, which is up from just 2% in 1965. We're working harder than ever before. American men and women are working 12 to 13 hours more per week today than we were in 1968. Stress levels are off the chart for most people. We don't feel like we have enough time for rest and leisure, and even when we go on vacation, many of us are compulsively checking our email and social media accounts. Finally, many of us live and work in isolating and alienating social environments that are disconnected from the natural world that we evolved in from other people. It may seem like this has been going on for quite some time, but if you think of human history as a football field and you started walking from one end to the end zone to the other, for the first 99.5 yards, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. It's only in the last half yard of that 100-yard football field that we developed agriculture, and only in the last few inches of that last half yard that the Industrial Revolution has occurred. The profound mismatch between our genetic heritage and the modern environment that we live in today is responsible for the epidemic of modern disease that we're suffering from, and it also explains why the paleo diet and lifestyle have helped so many people. The third principle of the future of medicine is that it applies to a functional medicine approach to care. The best way to describe functional medicine is to contrast it with conventional medicine, and I'm going to do that in the next few slides. In some way, this is not going to be a fair comparison because I'll be presenting the best case for functional medicine and in some ways, the worst case for conventional medicine. As I said before, conventional medicine has some amazing characteristics. It's remarkable in terms of trauma and emergency medicine and acute care, but again, I think we can all agree that it's not very good at treating chronic disease, which is the number one problem that we are all facing today. Functional medicine is investigative. It treats symptoms by addressing the root of the problem, which leads to more profound and longer-lasting results, whereas conventional medicine tends to be more superficial, in that it masks or suppresses symptoms but doesn't address the underlying cause, and this tends to create patients for life. For example, if you have high blood pressure, you get on a drug to lower it, and you're basically told to take that for the rest of your life, and that same is true for high cholesterol. Functional medicine tends to be more holistic. It treats the body as an interconnected whole, and we recognize that in order to treat one part, all the other parts must be addressed as well, whereas conventional medicine is more dualistic. It views the body as a collection of separate parts. In fact, there's a doctor for every different part of the body, and there's often very little communication between these doctors or acknowledgement of any kind of connection. Functional medicine tends to be safer. Treatments typically have fewer side effects, risks, or complications. We emphasize diet, lifestyle, supplements, and herbs, and unrelated complaints often will improve spontaneously in its treatment. Conventional medicine tends to be more dangerous. Drugs and surgery can have serious side effects and complications, including death, and this is evidenced by the fact that medical care, as we discussed earlier, is either the third leading cause of death or the first leading cause of death. Functional medicine is patient-centered. This means that we treat the patient, not the disease. We recognize the individuality of the patient, and we know that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. In fact, patients with the same condition, like ulcerative colitis, for example, may get a completely different treatment based on the particular etiology or pathogenesis of their particular condition. Conventional medicine, on the other hand, tends to be more disease-centered. It treats the disease and not the patient, and patients with the same disease will often get the same treatment plan despite differences in their presentation, genetics, or environment. In functional medicine, The patient is respected, empowered, educated, and encouraged to play an active role in their healing process, whereas in conventional medicine, the patient's opinion is often discounted or ignored. Little time is spent on education, and the patient is even sometimes actively discouraged to play a strong role in their own healing process. Functional medicine is integrative. It combines the best of allopathic and alternative treatments. It doesn't exclude drugs or surgery when they're necessary, but does tend to focus more on diet, lifestyle, supplements, and herbs as the primary interventions, whereas conventional medicine is more limited in its scope. It typically relies almost exclusively on drugs and surgery, despite risks, and while it does pay some lip service to the importance of nutrition and lifestyle, physicians are undereducated on these topics and often don't even have time to devote to them in the typical patient interaction. Functional medicine is preventative. It's guided by the ancient Chinese proverb, "The superb physician treats disease before it occurs," whereas conventional medicine tends to be a little more reactive. It really aims to manage disease after it occurs and often doesn't intervene until disease has progressed beyond a certain point of no return. Trained functional medicine physicians work off of something called the ADAPT framework. The ADAPT framework embraces these 3 principles and incorporates them into a systems model of functional medicine that's been developed. This model informs the way that I think about patient care, and I would like to invite you to think about it. At the core of this model is the relationship between the exposome and the genome and epigenome, which we've been discussing here in this presentation. It's the interaction between our genes and the exposome and how that interaction affects epigenetic expression or the expression of our genes that largely determines our health and underlies most human disease. The next ring out is pathology. When the modern diet and lifestyle and environment affect expression of genes, that leads to pathology, which can be defined as deviation from normal physiology that characterizes or constitutes disease. In short, they're mechanisms that give rise to disease. Examples might include small intestine bacterial overgrowth, low stomach acid, or gut infections as pathologies that underlie the disease or syndrome that we call irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease or gastroesophageal reflux disease. Then things like insulin resistance, leptin resistance, and inflammation are the pathologies that give rise to diseases like type 2 diabetes or syndromes like metabolic syndrome, and impaired methylation and mitochondrial dysfunction might be the mechanisms or pathologies that underlie the syndromes or diseases that we call depression, ADHD, or anxiety. From pathologies, we move to diseases and syndromes, which I haven't listed here, but a disease is a disorder of a structure or function that produces specific signs and symptoms. Syndrome is not as well defined as a disease, but it is a collection of signs and symptoms that is recognized as a particular entity but may not be as specific in terms of the etiology or pathogenesis. I've already mentioned a couple of examples of syndromes, like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. Fibromyalgia syndrome would be another one, and premenstrual syndrome would be another one. We know that they exist. They affect people, and that they can even be quite serious in their effect, but they're labeled as syndromes because we don't fully understand their etiology or pathology. Or in fact, and this is what I certainly believe and what I think the research supports, that they may have multiple etiologies and pathologies, so they're actually a collection of several different diseases or pathologies that we have grouped together under one syndrome umbrella. Of course, examples of diseases would be things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and even cancer. Finally, the outer ring of this system, or the systems model, is symptoms. And these are the outward manifestations of dysfunctional diet, lifestyle, and environmental interaction with genes and the epigenome that leads to pathologies and disease. Of course, the symptoms are the way that we actually experience everything that comes before them in the systems model. In conventional medicine, they typically approach treatment from the outside in. So again, the focus is on suppressing symptoms, which is the outer ring, with drugs or surgery and managing disease, which is the second ring in, trying to slow the progression and help the patient to live with the symptoms. There's nothing wrong with that per se, with helping the patient to live with the symptoms and slowing the progression, and acute stage care when these diseases get severe is necessary, but of course, in functional medicine, we are looking for something different. We're looking to prevent disease before it even occurs, and to do that, we need a different approach where we work from the inside out in the systems model. We start with the interaction between the exposome and genome and epigenome, and we focus on diet, diet, lifestyle, and environmental influences, and then the next step is to correct the pathologies that underlie disease and symptomology. That's really a fundamentally different model and at the core difference between functional and conventional medicine. If you or someone you know is currently suffering from a chronic health condition, or maybe you're someone who's interested in preventing disease and experiencing high performance, then I urge you to contact me by visiting www.drdaniel.com. Thanks for watching.